Unit 2. Merriam-Webster's Vocabulary Builder. Mania in Latin means madness, and the meaning passed over into English unchanged. Our word mania can mean a mental illness, or at least an excessive enthusiasm. We might call someone a maniac who was wild, violent, and mentally ill, or maybe just really enthusiastic about something. Too much caffeine might make you a bit manic. But the intense mood swings once known as manic-depressive illness are now usually called bipolar disorder instead. Kleptomania. A mental illness in which a person has a strong desire to steal things. Kleptomania leads its sufferers to steal items of little value that they don't need anyway. Klepto comes from the Greek word kleptein, to steal. Even though kleptomania is often the butt of jokes, it's actually a serious mental illness, often associated with mood disorders, anxiety disorders, eating disorders, and substance abuse. Kleptomaniacs tend to be depressed, and many live lives of secret shame because they're afraid to seek treatment. Dipsomaniac. A person with an extreme and uncontrollable desire for alcohol. She didn't like the word alcoholic being applied to her, and liked dipsomaniac even less. Dipsomaniac comes from the Greek noun dipsa, thirst, but thirst usually has nothing to do with it. Some experts distinguish between an alcoholic and a dipsomaniac, reserving dipsomaniac for someone involved in frequent episodes of binge drinking and blackouts. In any case, there are plenty of less respectful words for a person of similar habits: sot, lush, wino, souse, boozer, guzzler, tippler, tosspot, drunkard, buzzhound. The list goes on and on and on. Megalomaniac. A mental disorder marked by feelings of great personal power and importance. When the governor started calling for arming his National Guard with nuclear weapons, the voters finally realized they had elected a megalomaniac. Since the Greek root megalo means large, someone who is megalomaniacal has a mental disorder marked by feelings of personal grandeur. Megalomania has probably afflicted many rulers throughout history. The Roman Emperor Caligula insisted that he be worshipped as a living god. Joseph Stalin suffered from the paranoia that often accompanies megalomania, and had thousands of his countrymen executed as a result. J. B. Bokassa, dictator of a small and extremely poor African nation, proclaimed himself emperor of the country he renamed the Central African Empire. And even democratically elected leaders have often acquired huge egos as a result of public acclaim. But megalomaniac is generally thrown around as an insult and rarely refers to real mental illness. Egomaniac. Someone who is extremely self-centered and ignores the problems and concerns of others. He's a completely unimpressive person, but that doesn't keep him from being an egomaniac. Ego is Latin for I, and in English ego usually means sense of self-worth. Most people's egos stay at a healthy level, but some become exaggerated. Egomaniacs may display a grandiose sense of self-importance, with fantasies about their own brilliance or beauty, intense envy of others, a lack of sympathy, and a need to be adored or feared. But, like megalomaniac, the word egomaniac is thrown around by lots of people who don't mean much more by it than blowhard or know-it-all. Psyche comes from the Greek word psyche, meaning breath, life, soul. Psychology is the science of mind and behavior, and a psychologist treats or studies the mental problems of individuals and groups. Psychiatry is a branch of medicine that deals with mental and emotional disorders, and a psychiatrist, like any other doctor, may prescribe drugs to treat them. Psyche. Soul, personality, mind. Analysts are constantly trying to understand the nation's psyche and why the U.S. often behaves so differently from other countries. Sometime back in the 16th century, we borrowed the word psyche directly from Greek into English. In Greek mythology, Psyche was a beautiful princess who fell in love with Eros, Cupid, god of love, and went through terrible trials before being allowed to marry him. The story is often understood to be about the soul redeeming itself through love. To the Greeks, Psyche also meant butterfly, which suggests how they imagined the soul. In English, Psyche often sounds less spiritual than soul, less intellectual than mind, and more private than personality. Psychedelic. 1. Of or relating to a drug, such as LSD, that produces abnormal and often extreme mental effects such as hallucinations. 2. Imitating the effects of psychedelic drugs. In her only psychedelic experience, back in 1970, she had watched with horror as the walls began crawling with bizarrely colored creatures. The most famous, or notorious, of the psychedelic drugs is LSD, a compound that can be obtained from various mushrooms and other fungi but is usually created in the lab. The other well-known psychedelics are psilocybin, likewise obtained from fungi, and mescaline, obtained from peyote cactus. How psychedelics produce their effects is still fairly mysterious, partly because research ceased for almost 20 years because of their reputation, but scientists are determined to find the answers and much research is now underway. Psychedelics are now used to treat anxiety in patients with cancer, and are being tested in the treatment of such serious conditions as severe depression, alcoholism, and drug addiction. Psychosomatic. Caused by mental or emotional problems rather than by physical illness. Her doctor assumed her stomach problems were psychosomatic but gave her some harmless medication anyway. Since the Greek word soma means body, psychosomatic suggests the link between mind and body. Since one's mental state may have an important effect on one's physical state, research on new medicines always involves giving some patients in the experiment a placebo, fake medicine, and some who receive the sugar pills will seem to improve. You may hear someone say of someone else's symptoms, "Oh, it's probably just psychosomatic," implying that the physical pain or illness is imaginary, maybe just an attempt to get sympathy, and that the person could will it away if he or she wanted to. But this can be harsh and unfair, since, whatever the cause is, the pain is usually real. Psychotherapist. One who treats mental or emotional disorder or related bodily ills by psychological means. He's getting medication from a psychiatrist, but it's his sessions with the psychotherapist that he really values. Many psychologists offer psychological counseling, and psychological counseling can usually be called psychotherapy, so many psychologists can be called psychotherapists. The most intense form of psychotherapy, called psychoanalysis, usually requires several visits a week. A competing type of therapy known as behavior therapy focuses on changing a person's behavior, often some individual habit such as stuttering, tics, or phobias, without looking very deeply into his or her mental state. CEPT comes from the Latin verb meaning take, seize. Capture, which is what a captor has done to a captive, has the same meaning. Captivate once meant literally, capture, but now means only to capture mentally through charm or appeal. But in some other English words this root produces, such as those below, its meaning is harder to find. Reception. 1. The act of receiving. 2. A social gathering where guests are formally welcomed. Although the reception of her plan by the board of directors was enthusiastic, it was months before anything was done about it. Reception is the noun form of receive. So at a formal reception, guests are received or welcomed or taken in. A bad TV reception means the signal isn't being received well. When a new novel receives good reviews, we say it has met with a good critical reception. If it gets a poor reception, on the other hand, that's the same as saying that it wasn't well received. Intercept. To stop, seize, or interrupt something or someone before arrival. The explosives had been intercepted by police just before being loaded onto the jet. Since the prefix inter means between, see inter, it's not hard to see how intercept was created. Arms shipments coming to a country are sometimes intercepted, but such interceptions can sometimes be understood as acts of war. In football, soccer, and basketball, players try to intercept the ball as it's being passed by the other team. In years gone by, letters and documents being carried between officers or officials were sometimes intercepted when the carrier was caught. Today, when these communications are generally electronic, an intercepted email isn't actually stopped, but simply read secretly by a third party. Perceptible. Noticeable or able to be felt by the senses. Her change in attitude toward him was barely perceptible, and he couldn't be sure he wasn't just imagining it. Perceptible includes the prefix per, meaning through, so the word refers to whatever can be taken in through the senses. A perceptive person picks up minor changes, small clues, or hints and shades of meaning that others can't perceive, so one person's perception, a tiny sound, a slight change in the weather, a different tone of voice, often won't be perceptible to another. Susceptible. 1. Open to some influence, responsive. 2. Able to be submitted to an action or process. She impressed everyone immediately with her intelligence, so they're now highly susceptible to her influence and usually go along with anything she proposes. With its prefix sus, up, susceptible refers to something or someone that takes up or absorbs like a sponge. A sickly child may be susceptible to colds, and an unlucky adult may be susceptible to back problems. A lonely elderly person may be susceptible to what a con man tells him or her on the phone. And students are usually susceptible to the teaching of an imaginative professor, that is, likely to enjoy and learn from it. Fin comes from the Latin word for end, or boundary. Final describes last things, and a finale or a finish is an ending. And at the end of a French film, you may just see the word fin, but its meaning is harder to trace in some of the other English words derived from it. Confine. 1. To keep someone or something within limits. 2. To hold someone in a location. He had heard the bad news from the CEO, but when he spoke to his employees he confined his remarks to a few hints that sales had slipped. Confine means basically to keep someone or something within borders. Someone confined to a bedroom or a wheelchair is too ill or disabled to be anywhere else. A person under house arrest is confined to his or her house by the government. At a business meeting, the discussion may be confined to a single topic. A town may keep industrial development confined to one area by means of zoning. And someone confined to the state prison for 20 years has probably committed quite a serious crime. Definitive. 1. Authoritative and final. 2. Specifying perfectly or precisely. The team's brilliant research provided a definitive description of the virus and its strange mutation patterns. Something definitive is complete and final. A definitive example is the perfect example. A definitive answer is usually a strong yes or no. A definitive biography contains everything we'll ever need to know about someone. Ella Fitzgerald's famous 1950s recordings of American songs have even been called definitive, but no one ever wanted them to be the last. Finite. Having definite limits. Her ambitions were infinite, but her wealth was finite. It has come as a shock to many of us to realize that resources such as oil, and the atmosphere's ability to absorb greenhouse gases, are finite rather than unlimited. The debate continues as to whether the universe is finite or infinite and, if it's finite, how to think about what lies beyond it. Religion has always concerned itself with the question of the finite, that is, human life on earth, versus the infinite, God, eternity, and infinity. But finite is mostly used in scientific writing, often with the meaning definitely measurable. Infinitesimal. Extremely or immeasurably small. Looking more closely at the research data, he now saw an odd pattern of changes so infinitesimal that they hadn't been noticed before. Just as infinite describes something immeasurable, without limit, infinitesimal describes something endlessly small. When Antony van Leeuwenhoek invented the microscope in the 17th century, he was able to see organisms that had been thought too infinitesimally small to exist. But today's electron microscope allows us to see infinitesimal aspects of matter that even Leeuwenhoek could not have imagined. Ject comes from jacere, the Latin verb meaning throw or hurl. To reject something is to throw, or push, it back, to eject something is to throw, or drive, it out, and to inject something is to throw, or squirt, it into something else. Interject. To interrupt a conversation with a comment or remark. His anger was growing as he listened to the conversation, and every so often he would interject a crude comment. According to its Latin roots, interject ought to mean literally, throw between. For most of the word's history, however, the only things that have been interjected have been comments dropped suddenly into a conversation. Interjections are often humorous, and sometimes even insulting, and the best interjections are so quick that the conversation isn't even interrupted. Conjecture. To guess. He was last heard of in Bogota, and they conjectured that he had met his end in the Andes at the hands of the guerrillas. Formed with the prefix con, together, conjecture means literally, to throw together, that is, to produce a theory by putting together a number of facts. So, for example, Columbus conjectured from his calculations that he would reach Asia if he sailed westward, and his later conjecture that there was a northwest passage by sea from the Atlantic to the Pacific over the North American continent was proved correct centuries later. Projection. An estimate of what might happen in the future based on what is happening now. The president has been hearing different deficit projections all week from the members of his economic team. Projection has various meanings, but what they all have in common is that something is sent out or forward. A movie is projected onto a screen, a skilled actress projects her voice out into a large theater without seeming to shout, and something sticking out from a wall can be called a projection. But the meaning we focus on here is the one used by businesses and governments. Most projections of this kind are estimates of a company's sales or profits, or of the finances of a town, state, or country, sometime in the future. Trajectory. The curved path that an object makes in space, or that a thrown object follows as it rises and falls to Earth. Considering the likely range, trajectory, and accuracy of a bullet fired from a cheap handgun at 100 yards, the murder seemed incredible. Formed with part of the prefix trans, across, trajectory means hurling across. By calculating the effect of gravity and other forces, the trajectory of an object launched into space at a known speed can be computed precisely. Missiles stand a chance of hitting their target only if their trajectory has been plotted accurately. The word is used most often in physics and engineering, but not always. We can also say, for example, that the trajectory of a whole life may be set in a person's youth, or that a new book traces the long trajectory of the French Empire. Tract comes from trahir, the Latin verb meaning drag or draw. Something attractive draws us toward it. Something distracting pulls your attention away. And when you extract something from behind the sofa, you drag it out. Traction. The friction that allows a moving thing to move over a surface without slipping. The spinning wheels were getting no traction on the ice, and we began to slip backward down the hill. A tractor is something that pulls something else. We usually use the word for a piece of farm machinery, but it's also the name of the part of a big truck that includes the engine and the cab. Tractors get terrific traction because of their powerful engines and the deep ridges on their huge wheels. A cross-country skier needs traction to kick herself forward, but doesn't want it to slow her down when she's gliding, so the bottom of the skis may have a fish scale surface that permits both of these at the same time. Retract. 1. To pull back something into something larger. 2. To take back something said or written. She was forced to retract her comment about her opponent after it was condemned in the press. The prefix back, gives retract the meaning of draw back. Just as a cat retracts its claws into its paws when they aren't being used, a public figure may issue a retraction in order to say that he or she no longer wants to say something that has just been said. But it's sometimes hard to know what a retraction means. Was the original statement an error or an outright lie? Sometimes a politician even has to retract something that everyone actually assumes is the truth. Thousands of citizens were forced to publicly retract their wrong ideas by the Soviet government in the 1930s and the Chinese government in the 1960s. Someone wrongly accused may demand a retraction from his accuser, though today it seems more likely that he'll just go ahead and sue. Protracted. Drawn out, continued, or extended. No one was looking forward to a protracted struggle for custody of the baby. With its prefix forward, protracted usually applies to something drawn out forward in time. A protracted strike may cripple a company, a protracted rainy spell may rot the roots of vegetables, and a protracted lawsuit occasionally outlives the parties involved. Before the invention of the polio vaccines, polio's many victims had no choice but to suffer a protracted illness and its aftereffects. Intractable. Not easily handled, led, taught, or controlled. Corruption in the army was the country's intractable problem, and for many years all foreign aid had ended up in the colonel's pockets. Intractable simply means untreatable, and even comes from the same root. The word may describe both people and conditions. A cancer patient may suffer intractable pain that doctors are unable to treat. An intractable alcoholic goes back to the bottle immediately after drying out. Homelessness, though it hardly existed 30 years ago, is now sometimes regarded as an intractable problem. Duc/duct, from the Latin verb ducere, to lead, shows up regularly in English. Duke means basically leader. The Italian dictator Mussolini was known simply as Il Duce, the leader. But such words as produce and reduce also contain the root, even though their meanings show it less clearly. Conducive. Tending to promote, encourage, or assist, helpful. She found the atmosphere in the quiet cafe conducive to study and even to creative thinking. Something conducive leads to a desirable result. A cozy living room may be conducive to relaxed conversation, just as a boardroom may be conducive to more intense discussions. Particular tax policies are often conducive to savings and investment, whereas others are conducive to consumer spending. Notice that conducive is almost always followed by 2. Deduction. 1. Subtraction. 2. The reaching of a conclusion by reasoning. Foretelling the future by deduction based on a political or economic theory has proved to be extremely difficult. To deduct is simply to subtract. A tax deduction is a subtraction from your taxable income allowed by the government for certain expenses, which will result in your paying lower taxes. Your insurance deductible is the amount of a medical bill that the insurance company makes you subtract before it starts to pay, in other words, the amount that will come out of your own pocket. But deduction also means reasoning, and particularly reasoning based on general principles to produce specific findings. Mathematical reasoning is almost always deduction, for instance, since it is based on general rules. But when Dr. Watson exclaims, "Brilliant deduction, my dear Holmes," he simply means brilliant reasoning, since Sherlock Holmes's solutions are based on specific details he has noticed rather than on general principles. Induce. 1. Persuade, influence. 2. Bring about. To induce him to make the call, we had to promise we wouldn't do it again. Inducing is usually gentle persuasion. You may, for instance, induce a friend to go to a concert, or induce a child to stop crying. An inducement is something that might lure you to do something, though inducements are occasionally a bit menacing, like the Godfather's offer that you can't refuse. Induce also sometimes means produce, thus, doctors must at times induce labor in a pregnant woman. Notice that induct and induction are somewhat different from induce and inducement, though they come from the identical roots. Seduction. 1. Temptation to sin, especially temptation to sexual intercourse. 2. Attraction or charm. The company began its campaign of seduction of the smaller firm by inviting its top management to a series of weekends at expensive resorts. Seduction, with its prefix se, aside, means basically lead aside or astray. In Hawthorne's novel The Scarlet Letter, Hester Prynne is forced to wear a large scarlet A, for adulteress, after it is revealed that she's been seduced by the Reverend Dimmesdale. Seduction also takes less physical forms. Advertisements constantly try to seduce us, often using sex as a temptation, into buying products we hadn't even known existed. Seque comes from the Latin verb sequi, meaning to follow. A sequel follows the original novel, film, or television show. Sequential. 1. Arranged in order or in a series. 2. Following in a series. In writing the history of the Revolution, his challenge was to put all the events of those fateful days in proper sequential order. Things in sequence, or regular order, are arranged sequentially. Most novels and films move sequentially, but some use techniques such as flashbacks that interrupt the movement forward in time. Sequential courses in college must follow each other in the proper order, just like sequential tasks or steps. Subsequent. Following in time, order, or place, later. Through all her subsequent love affairs, she never stopped thinking about the man who got away. The prefix sub normally means below, and the sub in subsequent seems to imply that everything after the first is somehow inferior. As the definition states, subsequent can refer to time. All our subsequent attempts to contact her failed. Order, the subsequent houses on the list looked even worse. Or place, the subsequent villages on the river heading east become steadily more primitive. But subsequently, as in, I subsequently learned the real story, simply means later. Consequential. 1. Resulting. 2. Important. None of our discussions thus far has been very consequential. Next week's meeting will be the important one. Something consequential follows or comes along with something else. The resulting meaning of consequential is usually seen in legal writing. For example, consequential losses are losses that supposedly resulted from some improper behavior, about which the lawyer's client is suing. But normally consequential means significant or important, and it's especially used for events that will produce large consequences or results. Non sequitur. A statement that does not follow logically from anything previously said. Rattled by the question, his mind went blank, and he blurted out a non sequitur that fetched a few laughs from members of the audience. Non sequitur is actually a complete sentence in Latin, meaning, it does not follow, that is, something said or written doesn't logically follow what came before it. It was Aristotle who identified the non sequitur as one of the basic fallacies of logic, that is, one of the ways in which a person's reasoning may go wrong. For Aristotle, the non sequitur is usually a conclusion that doesn't actually result from the reasoning and evidence presented. Sometime when you're listening to politicians answering questions, see how many non sequiturs you can spot. Words from mythology. Apollonian. Harmonious, ordered, rational, calm. After a century of romantic emotion, some composers adopted a more Apollonian style, producing clearly patterned pieces that avoided extremes of all kinds. In Greek mythology, Apollo was the god of the sun, light, prophecy, and music, and the most revered of all the gods. Partly because of the writings of Nietzsche, we now often think of Apollo, in contrast to the god Dionysius, as a model of calm reason, and we may call anything with those qualities Apollonian. This isn't the whole story about Apollo, however. He had a terrible temper and could be viciously cruel when he felt like it. Bacchanalian. Frenzied, orgiastic. The Bacchanalian partying on graduation night resulted in 3 wrecked cars, 2 lawsuits by unamused parents, and more new experiences than most of the participants could remember the next day. The Roman god of drama, wine, and ecstasy, Bacchus was the focus of a widespread celebration, the Bacchanalia. The festivities were originally secret, and only initiated members could participate. There was wine in abundance, and participants were expected to cut loose from normal restraints and give in to all sorts of wild desires. Eventually the Bacchanalia became more public and uncontrolled, finally getting so out of hand that in 186 BC the Roman authorities had it banned. Much the same Bacchanalian spirit fills tropical carnivals every year, including New Orleans Mardi Gras. Delphic. Unclear, ambiguous, or confusing. All she could get from the strange old woman were a few Delphic comments that left her more confused than ever about the missing documents. Delphi in Greece was the site of a temple to Apollo at which there resided an oracle, a woman through whom Apollo would speak, foretelling the future. The Greeks consulted the oracle frequently on matters both private and public. The prophecies were given in difficult poetry that had to be interpreted by priests, and even the interpretations could be hard to understand. When Croesus, king of Lydia, asked what would happen if he attacked the Persians, the oracle announced that he would destroy a great empire. What she didn't say was that the empire destroyed would be his own. Modern-day descendants of the oracle include some political commentators, who utter words of Delphic complexity every week. Dionysian. Frenzied, delirious. Only in the tropics did such festivals become truly Dionysian, he said, which was why he was booking his flight to Rio. Dionysius was the Greek forerunner of Bacchus. He was the inventor of wine, which he gave to the human race. For that gift and for all the wild behavior that it led to, Dionysius became immensely popular, and he appears in a great many myths. He is often shown holding a wine goblet, with his hair full of vine leaves, and attended by a band of goat-footed satyrs and wild female spirits called maenads. In the 19th century, scholars such as Nietzsche claimed that the ancient world could be understood as a continuing conflict between the attitudes represented by Apollo, see Apollonian, and Dionysius, that is, between order and disorder, between moderation and excess, between the controlled and the ecstatic. Jovial. Jolly, good-natured. Their grandfather was as jovial and sociable as their grandmother was quiet and withdrawn. Jove, or Jupiter, was the Roman counterpart of the Greek Zeus, and like Zeus was regarded as chief among the gods. When the Romans were naming the planets, they gave the name Jupiter to the one that, as they may have already known, was the largest of all, though only the second brightest to the naked eye. When the practice of astrology reached the Roman Empire from the east, astrologers declared that those, born under Jupiter, were destined to be merry and generous, and many centuries later this would result in the words jovial and joviality. Mercurial. Having rapid and unpredictable changes of mood. His mother's always mercurial temper became even more unpredictable, to the point where the slightest thing would trigger a violent fit. The god Mercury, with his winged cap and sandals, was the very symbol of speed, and the planet Mercury was named for him by the Romans because it is the fastest moving of the planets. His name was also given to the liquid silver metal that skitters around on a surface so quickly and unpredictably. And the word mercurial seems to have come from the metal, rather than directly from the god, or an astrologer's view of the planet's influence. Mercurial people are usually bright but impulsive and changeable, and sometimes a bit unstable. Olympian. Lofty, superior, and detached. Now 77, he moved slowly and spoke to the younger lawyers in Olympian tones, but his college friends could remember when he was a brash, crazy risk-taker. The Greek gods lived high atop empty Olympus, which allowed them to watch what went on in the human realm below and intervene as they saw fit. They insisted on being properly worshipped by humans, but otherwise tended to treat the affairs of these weak and short-lived creatures almost like a sport. So Olympian describes someone who seems lofty and, above it all, as if surveying a scene in which other people appear the size of ants. The Olympic Games were first celebrated in the 8th century BC, at the religious site called Olympia, far from empty Olympus, and Olympian today actually most often refers to Olympic athletes. Venereal. Having to do with sexual intercourse or diseases transmitted by it. In the 19th century syphilis especially was often fatal, and venereal diseases killed some of the greatest figures of the time. Venus was the Roman goddess of love, the equivalent of the Greek Aphrodite. Since she governed all aspects of love and desire, a word derived from her name was given to the diseases acquired through sexual contact. Most of these venereal diseases have been around for many centuries, but only in the 20th century did doctors devise tests to identify them or medicines to cure them. Today the official term is sexually transmitted disease, or STD, but even this name turns out to be ambiguous, since some of these diseases can be contracted in other ways as well.